Pilon, Executive Director at Hope for HIE, and today I'm really excited to have on Dr. Brian Kalish from SickKids Toronto in Canada, and he is a member of our Medical Advisory Board and is doing some really exciting work with HIE research. So welcome, Dr. Kalish, to our Q&A event. And those of you that are joining, make sure that you let us know where you're joining from, and you're welcome to ask questions along the way. If they are, related to the topic at hand, we'll definitely either try to integrate them into the conversation or address them at the end of the session. So I would love to hear, so people can get to know you a little bit about where you are and what you're doing, and kind of where you've been and what got your interest in the research you're doing.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Betsy. I'm really excited to be here. So as you said, I'm a staff neonatologist or a newborn intensive care physician at the hospital for sick children. And I'm also a clinician-scientist. And my lab focuses broadly on sort of developmental neuroscience, how the brain is formed and understanding molecular mechanisms, and then also understanding how we can better protect the fetal and neonatal brain. So the work in my lab kind of spans all the way from super basic fundamental neuroscience, studying neurons in a dish, to mouse models of brain injury or neurodevelopmental disease, and then sort of early phase translational work in babies with brain injury, including HIE. So in terms of how I kind of came to this, it certainly wasn't planned this way in my career. I'm originally from the United States and did my medical training largely in Boston. Went to medical school in Boston and did my pediatrics training and my training in newborn intensive care there. And during that training, I always knew that I wanted to pursue research, but I didn't really focus on neuroscience until I began to train in pediatrics and in neonatology, because it was then that I realized that we've made enormous strides, particularly in neonatology, in being able to improve the survival of critically ill infants. But what I see as the kind of final frontier in neonatology is being able to not just improve survival, but improve quality of life, and in particular, improve neurodevelopmental outcomes. So I realized that our ability to kind of protect the newborn brain was quite limited, but represented a major challenge to modern neonatology. So to me, that was a really kind of inspiring and exciting field to pursue. So that immediately directed my research interests. So that's what kind of led me here. So I did kind of advanced training in neuroscience while I was in Boston, and then came here to SickKids to start my lab about 1.5 years ago.
That is so exciting. And, obviously we live and breathe this from the, the family side of things. And, it's really incredible to see more and more research being done to tackle this area. And, our mission as a nonprofit is to work to improve the quality of life for children and families impacted by HIE. So, obviously we're very interested in your research and so I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of the specific things that you've been working on, and maybe give a little bit more information about kind of the context of mouse modeling. Because, for me as a non-clinician and that has, kind of done a big deep dive into trying to learn as much as I can, I noticed that is definitely a critically important part of getting research started and looking at understanding more about, perhaps, improving therapeutics and things like that.
Yeah, so I think that obviously studying the brain and neuroscience is incredibly complex. And before we begin to think about therapeutics in babies in particular, we'd like to have a wealth of evidence and understanding in models or in cells prior to launching into studies in babies or in humans, broadly speaking. So I think that there are, in order to kind of build that evidence around a particular potential therapy or mechanism, we use cells in a dish, and that could be human cells in a dish or mouse cells in a dish or other sort of neurons in a dish. And then we use, in particular in my lab, we use mouse models where you can either genetically introduce mutations that predispose and sort of replicate certain neurodevelopmental conditions, or you can try to replicate a human condition that might lead to brain injuries, like HIE, for instance. And that can be done in mice, in rats, or in larger animals as well. I think there are limitations to those studies and being able to replicate what really happens in babies. So that's why a part of my work also is trying to do early phase or the very beginning of studies in babies with therapies that have not been widely studied for this reason or for this indication. So in terms of the studies that we have going on right now in babies and children with HIE, the first one is what's called a phase 1, or a safety and feasibility study of a therapy called remote ischemic conditioning. It has a long name, but we abbreviate it RIC. And this is a therapy where you temporarily restrict blood flow to an extremity, the arm or the leg, for a period of time in repeated cycles. This therapy, the remote ischemic conditioning, or RIC, has been applied widely to adults with brain injury, with heart injury, heart attack, stroke, a variety of conditions. And it's also been used in premature babies with inflammation of the intestine, like necrotizing enterocolitis, as well as babies who are undergoing heart-lung bypass for open heart surgery. So it's been used in a wide variety of conditions, and there's some very promising evidence from mouse models and other animal models, but that it could be potentially therapeutic in conditions like HIE, but it's never been systematically tried before. So in order to do that, we first need to show that it's safe to use in babies who have HIE and who are undergoing therapeutic hypothermia. So we are very grateful for the families who are willing to participate in the study here. We're doing this out of the NICU at SickKids. And we're basically enrolling patients and slowly increasing the amount of time that we're exposing them to the therapy and the number of days that we're administering the therapy. And we hope that this information will then give us what we need to then do a definitive larger study where we would randomize children to RIC therapy or not, to show whether this is in fact helpful. And I think in general, this study is a model for how we think about adding additional therapies onto therapeutic hypothermia. So I think for many of the families who have had a child with HIE who's received hypothermia, hypothermia is a remarkable treatment that has really revolutionized our care of children with HIE. But despite hypothermia, there are still many children who suffer disability after HIE. And I think there's a great opportunity to develop these, what I like to call adjunctive treatments or adjunctive therapies that we would add on to therapeutic hypothermia to provide some additional protection to the brain. So I think RIC, might be, and I hope will be, one of those therapies. There's a second ongoing trial, but I can tell you about that a little bit later.
Sure. Yeah, it's just such a fascinating concept. So with, I think one of my questions right away is, so this would be done during hypothermia, or is this right after? So you said it's in conjunction, but I know that time period is only a couple of days too.
Yeah. So the dream would be that we would give it once a day, every day for the 3 days of hypothermia. That's kind of the model that we're shooting for. Right now, the lowest dose is that we're giving it just on the first day of hypothermia, and then once we show that that's safe, then we'll proceed to giving it on days 1 and 2, and then assuming that's safe, we would go to days 1, 2, and 3. So that's kind of the model for doing this in a very careful, stepwise fashion to make sure it's safe. And I think in some ways it can seem a bit, frustrating and slow from a research standpoint that we really just want to implement this. But I think this approach allows us to really test, to make sure it's safe, but also to do this in the most rigorous fashion so that we set ourselves well for doing a clinical trial to hopefully show that there might be a benefit.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for families to know just in general about research in therapies, because there's so many different, there's a lot of information and a lot of noise out there about, different things. And obviously our families are eager, to say the least, to help their kids in any way. Obviously these adjunctive therapies are really early on in the course of treatment, and very close after birth and whatnot, but I think a lot of that can translate to help people understand just why research takes as long as it does. And I think obviously we want things now that can help our kids. So but as you talk through the process of the importance of safety and efficacy, I really would love to hear a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind sharing, about what you found in that, and kind of how you might counsel families that are either enrolling in this trial, or just a little bit more, I guess, what families might want to consider or really think through when they're looking at potential therapies and where they are in research.
Sure. So I think that first I'll say that there are several potential therapies, adjunctive therapies, in addition to hypothermia, that are being actively explored by investigators all over the world. There are large trials ongoing for instance, erythropoietin as an adjunct to hypothermia, the drug melatonin as an adjunct to hypothermia, as well as several others. So certainly some of our work dovetails and adds to the existing work in adjunctive therapies. And I think one thing to know is that babies are a very unique class of patients. And as opposed to drug trials in adults, where I think we stand on a wealth of data, babies are really unique in terms of their organ function and the doses of drugs that are appropriate. So we have to do a lot of thinking and planning and testing in advance to make sure that the therapies we're going to use in this very fragile population are both safe, but also that they're appropriate to achieve the efficacy or the therapeutic endpoint we're hoping for. So I think it presents a very unique challenge. So I agree with you, Betsy, that there's always a lot of excitement and desire to try these therapies, but I think that there are a lot of potential pitfalls, and that's why those of us who do this work approach it with some I think cautious optimism. And I think in terms of how I approach discussing this with families, it's incredibly challenging. This remote ischemic conditioning trial, we aim to recruit and consent families within the first 24 hours of life. So as certainly you and other parents who might be listening appreciate, those are a pretty crazy, intense period for families who, most often never expected to have a child with HIE. In our center, babies are referred in and from a large catchment area, and typically I'm speaking with parents on the phone who are still exhausted from birth and overwhelmed mentally by what's just happened, and already phrases like HIE and cooling babies down for 3 days seem quite frankly crazy to people who are not in the community. So then when I call up to ask if I can temporarily restrict blood flow to the arm or the leg for a period of time, it's understandable that may seem incredibly overwhelming. And I think that is my greatest challenge, is how to provide the appropriate sort of emotional and medical support to families, while at the same time, trying to give them a clear understanding of, what is possible from a research perspective, and trying to provide, an informed consent and discussion during that really vulnerable window immediately after birth is just so deeply challenging. And I think that's shared across any of these current clinical trials with adjunctive therapies in addition to hypothermia. So we certainly, I think, do our best to provide information in a variety of ways, sort of written letters and discussions on the phone, and when possible, try to sit down with families in person so that we can, go through the details, in multiple ways. Because there obviously is when it comes to protecting the brain, there, time is incredibly important. So balancing the urgency with the desire to make sure that there's sort of full education about the interventions.
Definitely. Well, and I was reflecting that, in planning actually this year's Awareness Month, that 2022 marks the 20-year anniversary of the TOBI trials, which I think is really incredible to see where things have gone in 20 years. And so for those of you that might not be aware, TOBI trials were some of the initial cooling trials that were out of the UK. So, we've obviously, there's been many others, and that really is the basis of why we have, so much data on the safety and efficacy of cooling now. And so this is next level, next curve stuff, which is really, really exciting to see. So I think, thinking through, the conversations of those families that agreed to be in those initial trials, and, how they overcame some of the intrepidation that can come, to your point, and lived experience of, just how terrifying and shocking those early hours are, but how critically important it is to try to get those kids in as quickly as possible.
Yeah, those families really, paved the way for modern care for infants with HIE. So I think we're all deeply grateful for them. And you can imagine at that time, there was no therapy for these babies, and then, offering them this opportunity. And I think now we're very fortunate to have the potential to offer some therapy, but trying to at the same time convey the fact that we've made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of progress yet to be made before we really meet all of the needs of the babies with HIE.
Absolutely. Yeah. So maybe this is a good segue into the next part of your research.
I think a lot of work in HIE right now is focused on that immediate period after birth, where we try and either give interventions like remote ischemic conditioning or drugs to try and protect the brain, in addition to therapeutic hypothermia. One of my interests, though, is in trying to figure out how we can sort of accelerate recovery of the brain, a little bit further along after the period of injury. So I think there's, maybe potential opportunities after hypothermia and even after a child has left the NICU to potentially increase kind of neuro rehabilitation or neuro restoration, because that period of recovery continues for weeks and months after a child goes home. And that's why, I always tell families that the home environment after a child goes home is quite frankly often as important as anything we do in the NICU, because there's such an intense period of what we call plasticity, the ability of the brain to change and repair itself, after injury. So my hope is that we can provide interventions during that period to also increase the repair and kind of augment this natural plasticity that occurs. So one drug that's been studied for this in older children and in adults is actually one of the oldest drugs we use, a drug called metformin, which is often prescribed in older adults for type 2 diabetes. But it turns out that drug has some pretty interesting potential in terms of augmenting sort of neuro repair, neural stem cell mobilization, plasticity, and other sort of beneficial effects on the brain. And it's been studied in older children who have had brain injury for a variety of reasons, but it's never been studied in infants. So we just received some funding to try and study this for the first time in infants with HIE. So I think the unique thing is that we're not going to be giving it in the NICU or in the immediate newborn period. We're actually going to be giving it after they go home as a means to try and increase this kind of repair and plasticity long term. So as I said, again, this is called a phase 1 or a very early phase safety and feasibility study, just so we can understand the doses that we need to give it in those children. But our hope is that this is going to provide, again, another alternative or another tool in our toolbox for which to kind of increase the potential for children with HIE.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think, the potential to offer something obviously after that initial neonatal period would be a complete game changer. And, you know, I think when we first spoke about this, you had said that it was like it's been done a lot of work with neuro-onc kids, right? So a lot of brain, like kids who go through brain cancer and have a secondary injury based off of the treatment that they receive to take care of the brain cancer. You know, I was looking through the literature a little bit and just to see like what other things like that could be tested, you know, like and brought over from other disciplines. So I think that is really just such a, I mean, again, sounds very next level and really exciting to hear that there might be something. So what is the, so you said you just got, you know, funding and things like that. When is your anticipated start date, do you think, for that?
And just to stay on your comment, Betsy, I think that there's probably a lot that we can learn from studies in older children and certainly in adults where they, you know, have larger patient populations of individuals with brain injury. You know, some of the same principles, not all of them, but some of the principles do apply to children. And I think learning from the experience of those patients and the ongoing trials, I think we can adopt more of those things into you know, neonates with brain injury. So that's part of what kind of inspires some of my work, and certainly this work on metformin. And as you said, some colleagues of mine actually here at SickKids, Don Mabbitt and others, did a study in children exposed to cranial radiation, so radiation to the brain as part of their cancer therapy. And again, the study wasn't designed to try to show a benefit. It was designed to look at safety, as my study is. But it did show some very promising early results. And there are actually a few ongoing large studies to look at metformin as a means for protecting the brain after a variety of injuries. So I think it represents a really exciting therapy. So we're hoping, you know, we're currently going through the regulatory processes here. We're hoping to actually start enrolling patients within a few months, if not sooner.
So this is all extraordinarily exciting. And you must, I mean, how does it feel to be someone that is like, especially I'll say our weekly theme is hope inspires creativity. And I think there's nothing more creative than researchers, because you are truly, you have to be creative in this field to do things that have not been done before. So what's that feel like when you're approaching this and looking at, you know, different things to try to potentially have these huge breakthroughs? That's really exciting on our side.
From my perspective, I feel like I have the best job because you know, on any given day I can, you know, take care of babies and interact with families in the NICU, and then even in the same day I'm in the lab, you know, trying to advance research on a variety of fronts, sort of spanning basic all the way to these kind of translational first in human studies. So it's just a deeply, deeply rewarding career from my perspective. And I love interacting with families who you know, have babies in the NICU or have since left the NICU, and sort of talking about their experience and, you know, their hope for therapies for the future. And I think we can learn a lot from the perspective of families of what they value as we kind of design clinical studies going forward, because ultimately all of these therapies are, you know, the intention is that they improve the quality of life of, you know, the child and the family, sort of globally speaking. So I think trying to tailor the research to address their needs is something that I really strive for. Yeah, it's, you know, it can be an overwhelming path. It is a long, hard path to bring new therapies to kind of clinical practice. It can take decades sometimes. It takes a lot of resources and effort, and so it can seem extraordinarily daunting from the side of, you know, when I'm sitting in my office writing grants or things like that. But I think it makes it all worth it when I get to interact with families, particularly those who are kind of yearning for additional options for their child.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting, just in observations, you know, there's a lot of attention that's focused, understandably, to rare and in particular genetics right now. So, I feel like seeing an increase in interest in more, structural neuro versus, genetics. So, I would like to, I guess hear from you if you've seen that as well, or you think this is a huge growth area that you want to encourage more people to join in on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I would say that there's a shift there, but I think because we're probably still at a phase where we're learning so much about the influence of genetics in shaping risk of HIE and sort of brain injury in the newborn period. And really, most NICUs are still in the process of kind of implementing genetic care as part of their armamentarium. So I think we're going to be in that phase for over the next 10 years where genetics is going to be leveraged very strongly in our understanding of care. But from a structural standpoint, certainly imaging and MRI and those things are a very also an important part of our toolkit, and to understanding how the brain is supposed to evolve with normal development, and how that can become perturbed in the context of injury. But really, I think a lot of the attention over the past decade or so has been in describing the brain injury, describing the imaging, what we see, and how that relates to outcome. And I think now it behooves us to use that information to actually design therapies that change that trajectory. So I think we're at that tipping point where we have all that information about structure, about what gets changed with injury. Not to say that we've answered all of those questions, but I think we have enough that designing and testing interventions is really possible now for the first time.
So exciting. Well, there have been a couple questions asked in the chat. And so if you wouldn't mind, and if this is something outside of your scope, or something that you would defer to another time, we can certainly get it answered later as well. But I think this is a good one too, because we know that not all HIE babies are full term, and there's a question about prematurity. So are there any therapy studies, research on prees that suffered HIE but cooling was not possible or offered?
That is a great question, and it's something that I am actually really interested and inspired about, because I find those situations as a clinician to be deeply challenging, personally as a clinician, and in the conversations with families, because we set these cutoffs about age at which patients are eligible for hypothermia, and those can change slightly place to place, but for the most part, in particular, very premature infants are not at all eligible for hypothermia for a very good reason. But then we're left without a therapy, and it is always incredibly challenging when we have no therapy to offer whatsoever. So I think there is a deep need to develop adjunctive therapies or therapies for HIE in the preterm population, because it absolutely occurs. But I think we actually lack even a good description of how big the problem is and what it looks like, because it can be a bit more challenging to describe HIE in the preterm population as opposed to the term population, because there's several what I would call confounding factors at play, several variables that kind of interact together to cause brain injury, because the baby is born during a period where the brain is actively developing, so that it creates a very different type of injury. But I think that without saying too much, I think that we might be able to co-opt some of the current adjunctive therapies and think about how they might apply to the preterm population. As some people may be aware, there was a large study studied over many centers where they looked at an intervention, a drug called erythropoietin, in very preterm infants, in the hope that it would improve their neurodevelopmental outcomes. And when given to all preterm infants, it didn't show a substantial benefit. But one unsubstantiated hypothesis might be that in a targeted population, and a baby who is preterm but who has brain injury, perhaps if we focus on those babies, we might be able to see a benefit. So there's no evidence for that to date, and certainly no trials that I'm aware of, but it's something that has been inspiring for me and something that I'm actively looking into. So certainly if there are folks listening in who have thoughts or on that, I'd be happy to hear more.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. I think, obviously HIE is so complex and there's so many factors, causes, and, and that can affect, just qualification or even just geography, getting in within a certain period of time or just slightly missing a window. So I know, we've talked about, mild HIE research in particular, and there's going to be some more, we're hopeful for multi-center trials on that to see if there's some, good efficacy that shows improved outcomes. And, I say this often when, we talk about cooling, is the hardest thing for families is knowing that they missed that for whatever reason, whether it's gestation or, or things out of their control, geography, or just, being just slightly outside the window in some way, because they just won't know if that was something that could have helped, which is a very difficult thing to have to live with. I know that's a huge, part of what is talked about in our community for that population of families.
Absolutely. And I think, the treatment of babies with either mild, quote unquote, mild HIE, or babies who sort of are on the border of other kind of criteria for hypothermia is one of the most controversial areas in neonatology, quite frankly. And there is a great deal of discussion in the medical community about that. And there are a lot of difficulties in designing research trials to address those questions, but I'm hopeful that in the coming years, we'll have some clearer answers. But I think all the more reason to support other therapies that might not rely on this sort of critical window and inclusion in the hours after birth, so to speak.
Yes, I love that. That's so important. And then just one question, a little bit related to cooling, if you can give some insight into this. The question is, when cooling, how important is maintaining a consistent temperature in the maintenance phase versus having some fluctuation?
I think without sort of providing specific medical advisory, right. I think that cooling, we've adopted in terms of our practice in neonatology with babies with HIE. We obviously have evidence from the TOBY trial and other large international studies of hypothermia, and then also insight from trials of hypothermia in older children after cardiac arrest, for instance. So I think there's a growing body of literature on hypothermia for protecting the brain, broadly speaking. And I think some of the lessons from that are, one, avoiding high temperature. So I think if I had to say anything in terms of the consistency to answer the question, is that what would be most important to me is, avoiding periods where the temperature really exceeds that target range that's set, or, particularly goes higher than normal. That's where I would become, worried is perhaps too strong a word, but I think that's something that I would try to avoid. When we think about our strategy for, quote, neuroprotection or sort of brain protection, it is all about consistency. You try and, keep several variables the same in order to allow the brain to have the optimal sort of environment for healing and recovery. So trying to keep the temperature optimally in the targeted range, trying to keep the blood glucose normal and consistent, trying to keep the electrolytes sort of normal and consistent. Now, that's all part of what I call the package of therapy that we try to provide to protect the brain. So the simple answer is, I think it's most important. Small fluctuations in temperature, I think, are unlikely to have any effect whatsoever on outcome. It's avoiding high temperature above a normal body temperature that I would see as most critical. And that's information that we gain from other trials, even in older children with hypothermia.
Yeah, thank you for providing that clarification. I think there's just so much information to digest sometimes for families. And these things make you wonder, and you go, okay, well, did we get in early enough? Did we, do all the things that we could do? And just, and then we have cases of kids that have kind of a spontaneous collapse, 24, 48 hours after birth and start seizing. And, we have plenty of those in our community, and, what the protocols have been for that. And, and all of those things, deserve more, more attention, so that way we can continue to help. But again, there's so many cases and so much variety. It's difficult.
I think one of the things that's sometimes challenging for families in the NICU is that you're immediately thrust into an environment where there's an enormous amount of details, numbers and details about everything, and it's hard to know which number or detail matters and how much of a change really matters in terms of eventual outcome. And so a question like that in terms of the temperature, I think that is sort of the perfect example. We hope and we desire to control everything perfectly, and knowing how much of a change is significant or worrisome. That's definitely an ongoing conversation with the medical care team, because it can easily become overwhelming for families.
Right. Well, and we've seen it even in the past couple of years, some advances. I mean, in feeding and holding during cooling, we're seeing those becoming a new frontier of, my son is now almost 10 years old. He turns 10 in 2 weeks. And, I remember distinctly being told, it was important that we didn't touch him too much to affect the temperature or to agitate him, or, things like that could set off some of the, his different levels when you're really looking for stability during cooling. So, when I see pictures now of some families being able to hold during cooling, and now we have some growing research about the safety of beginning enteral feeds, during cooling, it's really incredible to see that we are evolving, and it might not seem that way sometimes if you're living this experience with a baby that has gone through this. But truly, I mean, as far as, research, there are certain things, certain aspects that are absolutely accelerating faster, I think, than typical timeframes have been.
Absolutely. And it's, I think another area that's actively being investigated, in addition, I think feeding and holding are two really good examples. And another example is, particularly for the babies with milder HIE who are getting cooled, what medications should we be using to try and keep them comfortable during that period, or how should we be managing sort of comfort and shivering during cooling, and how might those drugs kind of interact and affect our desire to protect the brain. So that's another active area of investigation.
Yeah, it's an exciting time, that's for sure. It's been really amazing to see these things continue. And again, it takes a creative mind to, think of new things and new ways of looking at all of this. So, I want to thank you so much for all of the work you're doing and the passion that you're bringing to this, because it, is just really, really amazing, novel work that is being done. So, and thank you so much for all of that work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you. It's just a real privilege to try and support this community and families in every way that I can. So hopefully some of this work will eventually translate into some broader benefit.
Yes, and we look forward to following it and reporting out on anything you report out. So again, we are here as a community to cheer you on and your work, and others that are undertaking similar things. I think we have a great community that any way that we can give back and turn kind of the pain we've been through as families into a purpose, giving back on, input. We do a lot of surveys with, researchers and things, just to drive that forward and make it better for the next generation. So, hopefully, eventually we're out of business at Hope for HIE. Yeah. That would be the goal.
Of course, and it's great to sort of raise awareness for families about the potential for research, because I think it helps normalize research as a part of sort of advanced care for these children, that we still have a lot of room to go and sort of maximizing our therapy. And in order to do so, we need to do research, obviously in a safe and ethical and sort of family-centered way, but it's an important part of our care. So I think raising awareness about that, so families are sort of willing and interested to engage is really critical.
Yeah, I mean, and to just, I think, drive home the point of earlier, when you talk about the families that originally took part in the cooling trials, that was a huge leap of faith and trust, to go through that. And I think that, you know, we have lots of families that like to get involved in and as much as they can. There's a lot of, you know, things on the CP side or, you know, the epilepsy side of different, you know, treatments or therapeutic options. And so, you know, there's different ways to get involved in those. And where would you, I mean, I have always heard, you know, just going to clinicaltrials.gov is a good place to search it out and see if there might be, but where would be some other conversations or ways to look at things that people could get involved in?
Yeah, it's tough because you know, clinicaltrials.gov, you could certainly search, and you know, the trials are often, you know, especially at early phases, restricted to a few or even one center. So it can be, you know, difficult for parents to actively get involved from that. But I think clinicaltrials.gov is probably the best place for to be aware of what is out there. And then I think, you know, ongoing conversations with the medical care team, who may be most sort of aware of what's out in the literature, because I think that then, you know, beyond clinicaltrials.gov, then you're in the realm of what is either published or presented at conferences, which, you know, can be a challenging amount of information for non-medical families to try to process. So I think if you're, you know, not in the medical or scientific realm, then trying to process that on your own can be incredibly daunting. So, you know, I might start by first chatting with sort of the medical providers you're connected with and letting them know about, you know, interest in research and understanding from their perspective what's out there, you know, before then extending out into the, you know, the broader literature, because it can become tricky to understand what therapies are available, you know, in a particular geographic region, or, you know, depending on the age and, you know, other factors related to the child. So yeah, I wish there was a simpler solution, and I think that's certainly a gap.
Yeah, and it's something I know there's a lot of, I mean, in particular, I know on the CP side and, you know, like neuro rehab and things, there's a lot of active interest in that. And the CP organizations who have started registries and worked on, you know, they're working on new novel, you know, physical therapies and things like that. You know, I keep seeing new releases and recruitment and things like that. So it's very exciting. And just, you know, again, there's a lot out there. So thank you so much for sharing. And
I'll just say that, I mean, not to just say this because I'm on the call with you, Betsy, but obviously in reflection, you know, parents and sort of advocacy organizations might actually be an incredibly rich source, because often the best sort of community are the parents themselves who are sort of actively diving into this, and at least you get sort of some community resources and awareness of what is out there, and then that information can be brought forward to sort of the medical or the care team. So I think that's an important part of the awareness about, you know, potential research-based therapies.
Definitely, and you know, that's something that I know we're trying to work on as an patient advocacy organization, is having families share in a little bit more about that. Like with the HEAL study, you know, we worked with the co-PIs in that to, you know, remind families that follow-ups are coming just as another means. And then as soon as we did that, people started connecting and saying, my child's in that study, you know, so just having those, being able to facilitate a little bit more of those connections on our side can also be helpful. You know, there's some incredible things going on. So it's, you know, it's really, it's such a good point that this collaboration, that's another reason, you know, our families come together and share so much information and can foster that another way in our community and other patient communities. So yeah, awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to, you know, have this chat with us today, to, you know, serve on our medical advisory board, and just the incredible work that you're doing. Really looking forward to following it and sharing updates as they come, and, you know, fingers crossed that it's all, it's going to be some really impactful things. But, you know, the great thing about research is we're always learning more. So, which can lead to other things too.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for the opportunity to chat, Betsy, and look forward to continuing to engage and hopefully help this community.
Great. All right. And thank you everyone who's been asking questions and tuning in. The conversation continues. This is a video that's going to be available afterwards as well. You're welcome to keep asking questions, and we can always, facilitate on getting this answered. And if there's other topics that you want to learn about, always, feel free to escalate those. We are very happy to bring, experts to our community on the topics that matter most. So thank you, everyone, and we will talk to you soon.